it water with the sheep in the box?
Of all the folk heroes of European history, few stick out as much and have endured so well as Robin Hood, alternatively known as Robin of Locksley, the Hooded Man, and Jeremy Corbyn. But how much of what we think we know about him is true? How can one even begin to quantify truth when discussing myth and legend? And crucially, can the legend of Robin Hood be claimed by the left, who point to his tendency to steal from the rich to give to the poor as evidence that he aligns with them, or by the right, who argue that he's an anti-big government aristocrat who above all fights against the collection of taxes, so by rights he should be a libertarian conservative hero? People like Sargon of Akkad, also known as the rape tweet candidate if you Google him, claimed his name and image whilst avoiding a Twitter ban, and he's really quite authoritarian, so what ideology exactly could one attribute to the legend of Robin Hood? Well, let's discuss it, shall we?
One of the earlier speakers started with Ayn Rand, and I'll do likewise. She, of course, had something to say about Robin Hood, as you would expect. So, through the mouth of Ragnar Danisgold in Atlas Shrugged, I quote, "He is remembered as a champion of need, a provider of the poor. But he was practicing charity with wealth he did not own. He is a symbol of the idea that need is the source of rights. He is the foulest of creatures, the most immoral, and the most contemptible." Anne, why don't you tell us what you really think?
There's a lot to talk about here when it comes to the class politics of Robin Hood. Was he a working class hero, a proto-socialist who wanted to seize the means of production and redistribute wealth in order to bring about economic and power equality, to tear down the established power structures and usher in a time of peace and fairness through anarchist-adjacent ideals and guerrilla warfare? Or was he an upstart lord presuming to take on the mantle of hero to the peasantry, a hypocrite, a bourgeois traitor to the working people, and a supporter of a supreme divinely ordained ruler who spent most of his time killing brown people in the Middle East? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, so we'll need to cover a lot of context before we can provide an answer. Starting with... It's often said that the true measure of a man is the company he keeps, and Robin Hood has possibly the most famous lineup of both friends and enemies in history. Let's discuss them one by one to ascertain what his connections might say about him.
Locksley! I'm gonna cut your heart out with a spoon!
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
As an anti-authoritarian, pro-worker kind of person, someone whose entire mythos centres around fighting those in power and stealing from the rich to give to the poor, it makes sense that Robin Hood's primary antagonists are, well, authority figures, and especially particularly cruel and or corrupt one. Allow me to demonstrate. The main villain of the piece, of course, is usually the infamous Sheriff of Nottingham, masterfully portrayed by Alan Rickman in Prince of Thieves and also Keith Allen in that TV show we pretend never happened.
Yes, I am the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Usually he's kind of a cartoon villain, less of a tragic Javert-style antagonist and more of a Joker-type figure. You know, he'll hang out with an evil witch and threaten to cut out people's heart with a spoon, that sort of thing. Essentially, of course, he was an old-school policeman, though most of the time he's portrayed as a sort of lord for some reason. It is speculated upon, though not conclusively known exactly who, if anyone, the character is based upon, but the post of High Sheriff of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and the Royal Forests did exist, so there are a number of candidates given the time period often provided, though even this can vary, as later tellings of the legend tend to place it earlier chronologically to add to the myth. Most likely, if, as in most versions of the Robin Hood legend, the story takes place during the absence of King Richard the Lionheart due to his involvement in the Third Crusade, it's possible that he's actually based on the real person who held the position at that time, William de Wendenall. Essentially, though, this isn't too important since the sheriff more more usually remains anonymous, known almost exclusively as the Sheriff of Nottingham. It is interesting to think about though, especially considering that just like the legend, Dewendinol was deposed from his position and replaced upon King Richard's return from the Crusades, with little reason having been recorded by history. But what is a sheriff, or rather what was a sheriff 800 years ago? Well, the word itself comes from the two words shire and reeve. A reeve was an official position which began in Saxon times, when the reeve was empowered to hold court and try civil and local criminal matters, kind of like a mixture of police chief and judge, or when the reeve gradually gained more power, judge, jury and executioner. A shire is a traditional term for a division of land, which at the time would usually have been countryside with maybe one central city or trading hub. Anyone who lives in the UK knows this because our counties mostly end in shire, or shire, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Berkshire and so on, and of course Nottinghamshire. This is the same reason why the hobbits of Lord of the Rings live in a place called the Shire, by the way, because that term epitomises old school British countryside living. After the Norman conquest, a reeve was appointed for every shire, and therefore the name became Shire Reeve or Sheriff, and was given additional powers and responsibilities, including, of course, collecting taxes, and many a Shire Reeve was known to artificially inflate those taxes in order to skim a little extra off the top. In other words, a corrupt lawman policing the fields and forests of Nottinghamshire with incredible amounts of power and very little oversight. A perfect antagonist for a principled outlaw hiding in the forests of Old England, or, if any aspiring screenwriters are watching, potentially ripe for a modern day retelling given the exposure of a lot of police overreach and corruption that has come out in the last few years, especially when it comes to how they treat those in the greatest need. Another primary antagonist of the series is Prince John, usually portrayed as the incompetent overseer of the sheriff, but rarely actively getting involved or participating in any direct actions himself. The history of John's involvement in the legend is actually very interesting. He never appeared in any of the original tales, and was only added in by playwright Anthony Munday around 1600, though he wasn't an outright villain, more of a flawed antagonist and rival to the heroes, with a few positive qualities. In fact, it wasn't until Sir Walter Scott's 1819 novel Ivanhoe that Prince John was cast as the outright evil villain, emphasising his more selfish, less noble characteristics. But why is John considered a villain at all? Well, as with most medieval history, it's complicated, but for the most part it's to act as a contrast for the good king in King Richard. Indeed, Prince John was hated during the time he was acting as steward whilst his brother was fighting in the Crusades, and is widely regarded as the inferior ruler by history. His attempted coup and usurping of the throne is often used as evidence of his villainy, as is his repeated affairs with married noblewomen and brutal, almost paranoid treatment of those he saw as potential threats to his leadership, including on one occasion demanding an enormous sum of money from one such rival, William de Braose, 4th Lord of Bramber, and when he refused to pay, he imprisoned his wife and sons, resulting in their deaths, and even his grandsons, who were eventually released after several years of imprisonment. But the thing is, when he was eventually crowned king in 1199, John was not unusually cruel or corrupt or incompetent by medieval monarch standards, which admittedly is a pretty low bar considering some of the awful things that people in power did to those they didn't like in the past. In fact, many historians contend that his attempt to seize the throne from his brother was arguably justified, given Richard's seeming lack of interest in the affairs of England whilst he was off fighting in the Crusades, and perhaps a more present king might have been a better alternative. However, he was famously a bit of a dickhead and really quite selfish and paranoid, which, let's be honest here, makes for an excellent villain, especially as people writing about Robin Hood wanted to make their support of the contemporary royal family clear, and honestly, if that's your goal, it's not a bad idea to make the primary villain of the piece a member of the royal family who is bad, but only because he's not as noble and virtuous as his brother, the true rightful king. Haha, please don't be mad, Your Majesty, I promise this isn't about you. Guy of Gisborne is another antagonist of the Robin Hood mythos, but a much less significant and fleshed out one. Usually he is portrayed as a mercenary, a hired sword who's been tasked with killing Robin Hood and bringing his head to the sheriff, and occasionally he's the sheriff's cousin or other distant relative. In the ballad he originally appears in, the famous shooting competition takes place. Robin wins, boasts about who he is, kills Guy, dresses up as him, presents Guy's head as his own, and then when let inside the castle, kills the sheriff. A lot of the time Gisborne is portrayed as a love rival for Maid Marian, though that is a more modern addition to the legend. A sword and a dagger he wore by his side, of many a man the bane, and he was clad in his capul hide, top and tail and mane. I dwell by dale and down, quoth he, and Robin to take am sworn, and when I am called by my right name, I am Guy of good Gisborne. What Guy of Gisborne represents is the corrupt and violent way justice was often doled out. In our modern day, a bounty hunter is someone like that one racist dude who brought people in for failing to show up to court, but in the Middle Ages, if someone in power wanted you dead, they could essentially hire a hitman to wipe you out and call it justice. Regardless, Gisborne, in contrast to the sheriff, is often portrayed as a sort of Javert figure, mistreated by his superiors and desperate to prove himself by catching Robin Hood. But in reality, he was just a throwaway villain in the original ballads who for some reason just captured the imaginations of future writers. Kind of like how the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who were just a throwaway monster of the week until Stephen Moffat decided to endlessly suck his own dick whilst writing future Doctor Who scripts, and the fucking Statue of Liberty was a Weeping Angel because, hey, why not? Also worth noting that he wears a horse costume made out of an actual horse skin with the head being a hood and so on for no practical reason, so he is arguably the first historical example of a furry wearing the first historical example of a fursuit.
Robin Hood and Little John walking through the forest, laughing back and forth at what the other has to say.
The Merry Men are criminals unjustly persecuted by a corrupt and elitist ruling class, who work to redistribute wealth from rich to poor and to fight against the oppressive, brutal system under which they live. As with all great stories, these characters often reflect or represent aspects of the society in which they were created, and also the ideas that the legends represent. All, for example, are lower working class and or serfs or peasants, from Much the Miller's son, who is, well, the son of a miller, pretty classic labourer's job, to Alan a Dale, who's a wandering minstrel, whose first appearance has him asking for Robin's help saving his lover from being betrothed to a higher class knight against her will, to Friar Tuck, who often serves as an example of the power of the church, which was enormous and was a major aspect of the ruling classes, holding incredible amounts of wealth and influence, being at odds with truly virtuous men, as the friar is a very godly man, but actively resists the church and performs, for example, weddings for the merry men in defiance of the church's hierarchies. Specifically, the Bishop of Hereford, who forbade the marriage of Alan a Dale to his sweetheart. In this way, he's very reminiscent of real-life modern priests who have rejected the church's dogma when it comes to, for example, homosexuality, like Reverend Kapia Kaoma or Bishop Christopher Senyonjo, who rejected the teachings of the Christian right in Uganda, mostly pushed by far-right evangelicals from the US, as shown in the fantastic documentary God Loves Uganda, at great personal risk to themselves, because in their mind, the mainstream church is not speaking the true word of God, but using it for earthly gain or mindless hatred. In some versions of the story, he is said to have been expelled from the abbey by his order because of his lack of respect for authority and his taste for good food and wine. In many tales, from Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar to The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, his first encounter with Robin results in a battle of wits in which first one and then the other gains the upper hand and forces the other to carry him across a river. This ends in the friar tossing Robin into the river in frustration. It's very similar to the tale of how Robin Hood met Little John with a quarterstaff fight over a river. It's actually possible that Tuck was based off a real-life French monk named Eustace, who was an active pirate and mercenary, but this has not been confirmed and is purely speculation. The list goes on, but I'm sure you get the point. The Merry Men support and help out tinkers, cooks, rangers, pinders and yeomen at various points throughout their legends. The only exception being, of course, Maid Marian, who, if we're going to talk about her, I suppose we'd better spend a while doing so because there's a lot to talk about. Maid Marian, unlike most of the other members of Robin Hood's band, is unusually interesting and varied in her interpretations and evolution over time. The others rarely, if ever, get much of a character or backstory, at least a consistent one. Little John, for example, gets he's big and sometimes dumb, but that's about the extent of it. She's never mentioned in any of the earliest extant ballads of Robin Hood, for example, but appears to have been a character in May Games festivities, which we'll talk about shortly, and is sometimes associated with the Queen or Lady of of May or Mayday. Some have suggested that Maid Marian was originally a personification of the Virgin Mary, for example, whilst others claim there's a more pagan origin for her character. Regardless, both a Robin and a Marian character were associated with May Day by the 15th century, but these figures were originally part of separate traditions. The Marian of the May Games is likely derived from the French tradition of a shepherdess named Marion with an O, and her shepherd lover Robin, though it isn't clear if this was intended to be Robin Hood, but eventually the two traditional tales and legends did sort of start to merge. Interestingly, the early Robin Hood is also given a shepherdess love interest, Clorinda the Queen of the Shepherdesses, and the name Clorinda survives in later stories as an alias of Marian. We'll talk about this in a moment, but the origin of the noblewoman Marian actually has similar roots to the nobleman Robin, as the characters were gentrified over time. By the Elizabethan era, Maid Marian was often positioned as the historical figure Matilda, daughter of Robert Fitzwalter, who had to flee England because of an attempt to assassinate King John, apparently due to King John's attempts to seduce Matilda, though this is likely embellished or simply fabricated, as there's no real evidence to suggest that this was the motivation. In later versions of Robin Hood, Maid Marian is commonly named as Marian Fitzwalter, only child of the Earl of Huntingdon, occasionally a childhood friend of Robin who by this time had already been recast as a nobleman. In Robin Hood and Maid Marian, a ballad dating to the 17th century, Maid Marian is described as a bonny fine maid of noble degree, of staggering beauty, wit and swordsmanship. Separated from her lover, she dresses as a page and enters the forest to reunite with him. Robin was himself disguised, so the two begin to fight when they met. As is often the case in these ballads, Robin Hood loses the fight to comical effect and Marian only recognises him when he yields. But fortune bearing these lovers a spite, that soon they were forced to part. To the merry green wood then went Robin Hood, with a sad and sorrowful heart, and Marian poor soul was troubled in mind, for the absence of her friend. With finger in eye she often did cry, and his person did much commend. Perplexed and vexed and troubled in mind, she dressed herself like a page, and ranged the wood to find Robin Hood, the bravest of men in that age. With quiver and bow, sword, buckler and all, thus armed was Marian most bold, still wandering about to find Robin out, whose person was better than gold. But Robin Hood he himself had disguised, and Marian was strangely attired, that they proved foes, and so fell to blows, whose valour bold Robin admired. They drew out their swords, and to cutting they went, at least an hour or more, that the blood ran apace from bold Robin's face, and Marian was wounded sore. "Oh, hold thy hand," said Robin Hood, "and thou shalt be one of my string, to range in the wood with bold Robin Hood, to hear the sweet nightingale sing." When Marian did hear the voice of her love, herself she did quickly discover, and with kisses sweet she did him greet, like to a most loyal lover. When bold Robin Hood his Marian did see, good lord, what clipping was there, with kind embraces and jobbing of faces, providing of gallant cheer. If you're familiar with most modern versions of the story, you're probably aware that a lot of the time Robin Hood is referred to as Robin, Earl of Locksley. Locksley being either a completely fictional place or else a small village in Yorkshire, which is quite funny to imagine Robin Hood with a flat cap, aka a member of the aristocracy. Not exactly the working class hero that's often portrayed, and as we just mentioned, he has a lot of loyalty towards Richard the Lionheart, King of England at the time, so again, there's not much really in the way of class politics there. It's mostly a Game of Thrones-esque power struggle between different factions and members of the aristocracy. In fact, some members of the story further clarify that the main cause of the conflict between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham is more to do with this conflict than some ideological back and forth between the rich and poor, which is an interpretation, I guess. We'll get into the stuff about Robin's aristocratic origins in the next section because it really is fascinating, but for now let's take it at face value and assume for the moment that the Robin Hood of legend was in fact born into the aristocracy. Does that mean that he can't be a champion of the working class, or that he is in some way detrimental to their plight? The short answer is no, and in fact I'd be willing to take it a step further and declare that actually, even if it were the case that Robin Hood was an earl, he'd still be able to be working class. Class arguably being a matter of material conditions rather than circumstances of birth, though of course there is significant overlap. It may be controversial, but I would be willing to call him a class traitor, but the good kind. What is a class traitor, you might ask? Well, in the simplest possible terms, it's a member of one economic class who utilizes their position to advocate against their own self-interest and that of other members of their class. Mostly, this is used in a negative context, like, for example, when the police, who are mostly made up of working class people, tend to favour protecting the rich and those in power over those with whom they have potential common ground because they're essentially working with the people oppressing their class. Robin Hood, however, is, I guess, kind of the opposite of that, more of a Carlos Maza type, in that he was born into privilege, wealth and power, and yet spends his time advocating and fighting for politics that explicitly benefits the poor over the rich, and chooses not to abuse his family's wealth and power for his own ends. Maza, of course, does this with his internet presence and content, but Robin Hood did this in a much more direct way by literally taking money and power from those who had it and transferring it to those who had none. Regardless of titles or origins, Robin Hood worked for the liberation and against the oppression of the poorest in society, and even if he was born into privilege, that doesn't necessarily detract from his legacy or his actions. Also, depending on the story, he was stripped of his titles and lands, which is why he became an outlaw, but regardless, the guy lives in the woods with a bunch of other peasants, chooses to operate outside of both the law and society, and robs rich people passing through the forest because they didn't make a similar, selfless choice. However he started out, the version of him we see in stories isn't exactly living the life of a nobleman, and viewing him through the lens of modern society, I would argue that actually, as class is mostly determined by your wealth and power, losing your wealth and power, either through choice or necessity, makes you working class. Hence why we on the left always advocate for taking landlords' property so that they're forced to get a real job, rather than scrounging a living off other people, rather than just like killing them or whatever. A landlord without property is just another worker, and that's fine. But was he even an earl anyway? Well, the legend of Robin Hood was incredibly popular throughout medieval England, which may have posed a threat to the ruling classes at the time. After all, if you have this incredibly popular folk hero, this idol, who explicitly expresses his heroism by thumbing his nose at the system and those in power, well, that's a little concerning if you're one of the people in power, right? And yet Henry VIII was a huge fan of the legend, going so far as to dress up as him and LARP with his friends. So how did this happen? Why was a figure of rebellion able to be so effectively usurped and adopted by the people he set out to fight against? Well, first we have to ask, what made Robin Hood appeal to the masses in the first place, and why in the world would a folk hero beloved of the peasantry be a member of the aristocracy who would eventually be personally pardoned by Richard the Lionheart and restored to his proper position over those who loved him? Is the real point of these stories not to imply that authority or absolute power corrupts and is ultimately a negative, but that only illegitimate supreme authority is to be condemned? Doesn't that kind of undermine the whole point? And crucially, we must ask, wouldn't the original tellers of the story, who were mostly of the lower classes, want the hero to be more like them, not less, or in some way superior by birth? Hey, so you know how right-wingers, centrists and capitalists like to use Martin Luther King Jr.'s image and words in order to attempt to discredit modern civil rights movements whilst ignoring the fact that Dr. King was a radical socialist who above all became frustrated with the white moderates who he accused of being more willing to enforce order than fight for justice, and yet is constantly used by modern conservatives to demonize movements that carry on his legacy like Black Lives Matter? Yeah, we're looking at a medieval equivalent here with Robin Hood. See, the original versions of the legend never actually included allusions to any kind of earldom or even the weird Richard the Lionheart stuff beyond the odd vague mention of loyalty to the king, but were pretty straightforward tales of Robin Hood and his merry men making friends, having jolly japes, and getting one over on the Sheriff of Nottingham, kind of like a medieval version of Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd, except Bugs is wearing green tights for some reason. No, see, these other kind of weird parts were a later addition, designed to retroactively make the character and the legend more palatable to those in power, who are often the ones with the power to tell new stories or edit the old ones, because only those with wealth, or at least access to it, could read or write, and usually the church, who recorded much of English history, were sympathetic to the monarchy, who worshipped and prayed to a god who, in their eyes, chose the monarch to rule via the divine right of kings. So what did that make a man who fought against the aristocracy? It was a gradual process, of course, not as simple as I'm making out here, but I'll leave a really interesting article that covers it in quite some depth in the description. But in short, the gentrification of Robin Hood is a well-known and documented phenomenon and is very much a deliberate ideological choice. The most famous of all the early ballads, A Little Jest of Robin Hood, was so popular it was reprinted 7 times by the mid-15th century. In the jest there are many traditional features and characters of the legend, but Robin does not give what he acquires to the poor. In fact, the only charity he shows is to a poor knight. Many historians have used this to dismiss the radical edge of the early legend. However, it can also be argued that the jest echoes the values of a feudal world where actual money meant little because, in feudal terms, use value rather than cash nexus. Taking people in, giving them protection, food, clothing, would have been seen as more beneficial than a cash prize. Another historian has compared the jest's sympathy for the knight with the ideas expressed in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where the rebels retained their allegiance to the crown and to the idea of a true religion, however violent their hatred for the king's courtiers, churchmen and other agents of what they felt to be an unfairly oppressive state. On this basis, the relatively sympathetic portrayal of the knight is compatible with a rebellious attitude towards the ruling order in general. In addition, the jest provides evidence that opposition to oppression was central to the early legend. At the beginning of the jest, Little John asks Robin for instructions and Robin replies that he must be good to the poor and to knights and squires that will be good fellows, but bishops and archbishops must be beaten on sight and the sheriff is the ultimate target. But see you do no farmer harm that tills with his plough, neither good yeoman that walks by the greenwood shade, nor no knight or squire that will be a good fellow, but these bishops and these archbishops you shall beat and bind, and the High Sheriff of Nottingham, keep him on your mind. As Knight points out, the jest after all advocates massive theft from the church, civic insurrection against and murder of a properly appointed sheriff, breach of legitimate agreement with a king. It is a story with much potency among people who experience institutionalized oppression and therefore require the relief of fictional forms of dissent. The Robin Hood ballads were a major focus for the idea that oppressive authorities can be resisted, even if this usually remained an aspiration rather than an active opposition. The tradition of the ballads was, therefore, a very powerful one. For centuries, Robin Hood was a symbol of independence, of resistance to authority in church or state. This concept is central to the whole saga and particularly prominent in the early ballads. By the 16th century, the idea of poor rural freedom as opposed to urban propertied restrictions was well established. This was a strong theme in the 16th century Robin Hood ballads and in the 17th century plays such as Robin Brome's A Jovial Crew, written in 1641. As the enforced enclosures of the common land and the superseding of old protective customs by new laws grew in pace, the newly destitute joined the droves of beggars and vagabonds who had always populated the countryside. It was possible for a bonded peasant or wage labourer to look with envy on those who dispensed with all social ties and responsibilities and lived in liberty in the forests. There's also, of course, the matter of the popularity of Robin Hood, Little John, Friar Tuck and Maid Marian appearing as mascots in rural festivals and events known as the May Games, as previously mentioned, which were generally kind of a county fair but slowly evolved into something arguably very radical. They eschewed the traditional puritanism of English Christianity at the time and, in the minds of those in the church, posed a threat to traditional morality, given that men and women were encouraged to drink, dance and sing lewd songs together. Further, it represented the disparity between powerful and powerless. The powerful hated the games, believing that they encouraged rebellious ideals to prosper and provided a kind of freedom to those with none. And of course, Robin Hood was a perfect symbol for this. Indeed, encouraged by this small act of rebellion and the symbol of Robin Hood along with alcohol, a lot of people at these events did indeed start to rebel, commit crimes, openly defy the powers that be, and so on, causing Parliament to make the symbols of these characters actively illegal and punishable by prison time. Over the years, however, the legend and his reputation as a symbol of radical anti-authority slowly waned and led to his gentrification. Robin Hood, for centuries a symbol of popular independence and resistance to authority, was quickly pressed into service. As part of the coronation celebration at Nottingham in 1661, a short play was enacted in which Robin's traditional loyalty to King Richard was carefully exaggerated. However, even before the Restoration, Robin had begun a process of gentrification. Firstly, Robin, being of base stock, was advanced to the noble dignity of an earl, and then he later acquired an inherited peerage. Representative of this process were two influential plays by Anthony Munday, The Downfall and Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, written in 1598. One possible reason for Munday's granting granting Robin nobility may have been that the success of his play depended on the patronage of the court, who liked to see themselves cast in heroic mode. Christopher Hill suggests that the impact of Munday's play was such that from the early 17th century the tales of Robin Hood came to be regarded as plebeian, perhaps in reaction to the attempt of Munday and others to make him a peer. The political significance of the character of Robin Hood must have certainly come into sharper focus in the 1590s, years of famine and social unease which laid the basis for Shakespeare's most political play, Coriolanus. Whatever the direct cause, many Robin Hood stories at the time show the process of gentrification, and their authors appear anxious not to enhance the status of secular heroes from among the common people. Martin Parker's A True Tale of Robin Hood, 1632, describes itself as a brief touch of the life and death of that renowned outlaw Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, vulgarly called Robin Hood, who lived and died in 1198. Some went to great pains to prove Robin's noble birth. In 1795, Dr. William Stukeley, Lincolnshire antiquary and fellow of both the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquaries, provided the fictitious Earl with a spurious pedigree of Norman nobles descended from Robert Fitzooth, who died in 1294, a fiction which was repeated by many and became an accepted part of the tale of Robin Hood. Another potential indication of Robin Hood's class origins is in his iconic weapon and skill set, the longbow. This is one of the most well-known parts of the legend and one of the most intrinsic. The famous archery scene where he wins by splitting his opponent's arrow, such as his accuracy, almost all art and depictions of him, including the iconic statue in Nottingham Town Centre, which I have visited, and if I can find a picture, I'll probably put it here, portray him as primarily an archer, though he of course does use a sword as well. Let's talk about the history and class politics of archery then. In general, archers, and especially longbowmen, were peasants, or at least not anywhere near nobility. This varied throughout history, but a lot of the time archers were professional soldiers who had higher status than serfs, but were still considered lowly and far from nobility, because often the longbow was a useful tool, easy to make, at least in comparison to, for example, a sword, and in fact for quite a while it was the law that every able-bodied man above the age of 14 had to practice archery for at least 2 hours every week. The nobility and those with the means usually preferred to ride into battle and get into the thick of the fray, so to speak. There was honour and glory to be won for the man who could ride into battle in expensive shining armour and deal great damage to the enemy without actually risking much due to their expensive, incredibly effective armour. Archers, by comparison, essentially had to stand on a nearby hill or plain firing volley after volley of arrows into the enemy ranks, and rarely, if ever, actually got involved in hand-to-hand combat unless the battle was lost and the enemy charged them down, due to the fact that usually they were unable to afford adequate armour or equipment, or at the very least not as effective as the plate armour the nobles and more well-off soldiers were able to access. After all, this was a time where each individual plate of armour had to be individually forged by a blacksmith. Your average peasant or farmer would not have access to that kind of equipment. Being or becoming a knight was a prestigious thing, and very few people of low birth ever got to achieve that sort of status, which is why a knighthood is still one of the greatest honours one can have bestowed upon them in the UK. This slowly waned over time as weapons like glaives were invented and the arms race ramped up, with plate armour becoming more and more effective alongside more ingenious anti-armour tactics designed to counter armour upgrades, and of course the better armour became, the less effective archers were, until the longbow became completely obsolete and began to be replaced by muskets and rifles beginning in the 17th century. So we must ask, why would a man who wears little or no armour, certainly not plate armour, doesn't seem to have a horse of his own, though he does seem to steal them fairly often, which is usually the hallmark of someone with money and who primarily uses a peasant's weapon, really be a nobleman or aristocrat? A man who goes into battle wearing only green tights on foot and is an expert in the use of a longbow would certainly not imply that, both to people at the time and also historians today. His legend may have been tampered with, attempted to be reclaimed or else otherwise rehabilitated as some kind of disgraced nobleman, but at his core Robin Hood is a lower class outlaw, an outcast, and a man who explicitly seeks to usurp and fight against the powers that be. He sees the injustices in society and seeks to, at least in some small way, mitigate them and resist them if possible. You can change it, say he's an earl, make him friends with the king, claim that all of his antics were under the protection of the crown, but the class politics of Robin Hood runs so deep that it's functionally impossible to do that without without it being extremely contradictory and obvious to anyone paying even the slightest attention or who is aware of any of the relevant history. It's especially confusing because Robin Hood is merely the first in a long line of outlaws or highwaymen or whatever to become folk heroes, and no one's going around claiming that Dick Turpin is actually Prince of Wales or some shit. The pretty ubiquitous ideal of the noble outlaw or highwayman was almost certainly started by the Robin Hood legend, but is not unique to it. After all, figures like Dick Turpin, James Hine, Claude Duval, John Neverson, 16-String Jack, William Plunkett, Gerard Jarosnik, and so on live on in legend precisely because we love the ideals they seem to represent, namely freedom, rebellion, and a sense of taking back what was stolen. Much like pirates, the highwaymen would prey almost exclusively on the rich and powerful, those who were able to prosper at the expense of others and who brutally exploited the vulnerable for their labour in order to extract capital from them. That only makes sense, right? After all, what's the point in robbing someone with no money? It's the logical thing to do, and just happens to align with radical ideas about privilege and class. Anyway, there's not much to say here that I haven't already said in my video on piracy, which you should also check out, so I'll keep it brief, but the fact remains that by dint of his existence, Robin Hood is an anti-establishment, really rather radical figure, as were those he inspired. People can try to neuter or gentrify him, they can try and curb his radical edge, but his legend and the legends of those who came after him will not allow that to happen. Robin Hood is a radical anti-authoritarian symbol, always has been and likely always will be. Yeah, calling your stock trading app Robin Hood isn't going to do much, and kinda makes you seem like you don't know anything about Robin Hood, though it's really quite fitting when people use it to fuck over massive hedge funds to the tune of billions of dollars, I'll give you that. Less so when you decide to shut down trading to protect the financial interests of the rich from the actions of the poor though. But okay, Robin Hood is a radical anti-authoritarian, sure, but can he be more accurately described as favouring the left or the right?
One thing is clear though, is Robin Hood wasn't a socialist. This common misconception, people on the left like this story because it makes them feel good about themselves. They feel themselves that they are some kind of Robin Hood, wanting to redistribute money from the rich and giving it to the poor. This isn't just a normal story of, someone who doesn't like the rich and wants to steal money from them. This is someone that is, Robin Hood is trying to take back taxes which he believes rightly belong to the people. Robin Hood isn't a socialist. If you want to be more accurate, probably more accurate to say, he's small government, he is a libertarian. I mean, he's not an anarchist, right? Because he doesn't just believe in just total chaos, people doing whatever they want.
Usually I don't like having discussions like this because at the end of the day, trying to apply modern politics or philosophy to ancient people, cultures or legends is often a massive waste of time and usually ends up ignoring context and evidence showing that these historical cultures are not analogous to our modern societies. We see the far right do this a lot, appropriating aspects of historical societies and peoples like the ancient Romans, Greeks or Vikings, applying their modern worldview to a context where, being honest, it doesn't belong, and it just makes no real sense to try to apply modern sensibilities to any ancient cultures like this. As it turns out, history is nuanced and complex, and not everything in the West can be so easily boiled down or compared to basically anything else in the West. The Romans were pretty ethnically diverse, the Greeks saw sexuality as a lot more fluid than often we in modern times do, and the Vikings had fascinating gender dynamics, all of which are ideas the far right call degenerate when they happen in our modern society, or an example of society's decline, for example. All of this to say, claiming that Robin Hood is, for example, either pro or anti-capitalist is not a productive conversation to have, but there are some people who'll do so anyway, so now we need to have the conversation, I guess, because am I about to let an ANCAP claim Robin Hood? It would be very presumptuous and very incorrect to claim that Robin Hood, his stories, or what he represents are in some way opposed to capitalism, or are actually socialist, just as people claiming that the West can be accurately compared to ancient Greek city-states or the Roman Empire. Robin Hood, if he existed, lived and died literal centuries before the idea of capitalism or private property ownership as we now understand it was anything more than a far-off dream in the eyes of peasants who wanted to become the land barons themselves someday. However, it is clear clear that the stories do represent a direct attack on feudalism and the ruling classes therein. One could perhaps draw a line between Robin Hood going after and attacking the powerful ruling classes by robbing them, stealing their gold and giving them to those in the greatest need, those people who effectively earned that gold in the first place, and modern progressive or far left ideals or policies, but it's still a bit of a stretch. This could be compared to the Marxist concept of wealth redistribution and labour theory of value, but to claim that Robin Hood was anti-capitalist is absurd. Anti-establishment perhaps, pro-collectivism maybe, but to criticise feudalism is not to criticise capitalism. I just wanted to make that absolutely clear before moving on, because much like some on the right are keen to take Robin Hood as a symbol of their ideology, we on the left should avoid falling into the same trap. Robin Hood is an enemy of the state, a radical symbol of freedom and opposition to the feudal system, and an advocate for the rights and interests of the peasantry over the gentry, and whilst parallels can be drawn, it's often unwise to do so, and I would urge caution when claiming ancient historical or mythical figures as representative of modern day ideologies, because the context of the society in which they lived is not going to be closely analogous to any modern day political system or set of beliefs. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about Robin Hood the ANCAP, I guess. Yeah, no, I'm not kidding. See, in the same way that I like and respect a lot of the ideas of, for example, Marxist-Leninists and certain more authoritarian-leaning people on the left, though for the record I don't like or agree with a lot of their ideas as well, because we share a lot of the same goals. To an extent the same is true of self-styled libertarians or anarcho-capitalists. Utterly cringe though they may be, because again, whilst I fully believe that they are deluded and have ultimately harmful and unrealistic ideas, their principles of freedom and anti-government, especially anti-police, are at least partially aligned with mine, though their end goals differ dramatically. All this to say, I don't fully agree with a lot of right-wing libertarian or anarcho-capitalist ideals, but they're mostly pretty harmless so long as they're honest, aren't a fascist pretending to be an ANCAP and don't gain any real power. Unless you're a road, I guess.
But I promise you, homies, you not fooling now libertarian by bringing up them bitch-ass roads. Fuck them hoe-ass roads, man.
But regardless, their appropriating of the figure of Robin Hood shows just as much ignorance as people claiming he was a communist. Probably the most common argument libertarians like to make when it comes to Robin Hood apparently being an ANCAP is that, much like them, he spent most of his time fighting against taxes and the government. After all, among the major issues the peasantry faced under the tyranny of the Sheriff of Nottingham were oppressive government control and unfair, ridiculously high taxes, keeping them in poverty by taking a majority of their earnings, like big government tyrants. You can probably see where I'm going with this, but let's just spell it out explicitly. Yes, the issue was a feudal lord taxing his subjects rather than an employer or capitalist exploiting the working class, but this is where the stuff I was talking about earlier comes into play. You can't just point to ancient legends and say, aha, well, the bad guy is a big government type who weaponizes taxes, and leave it at that, because there is significant context that's missing there. See, the power dynamics that exist today between government and citizen, or capitalist and worker, are really quite different from the way they would have been in the Middle Ages. Obviously, there wasn't really an industrial capitalist class oppressing the proletariat or whatever, but capitalism arose from the ashes of feudalism with most of these ideas preloaded into it. Or, to put it another way, the power dynamics that existed between worker and boss are really not all that different from those that existed between lord and serf, and indeed are much more similar than those between citizen and government. Sure, there was less of a hereditary nature to the dynamic, and under capitalism there is an illusion of choice and above all a slim chance to ascend from worker to boss given enough luck and or marketable talent, but ultimately the power structures remained, though they became slightly more fluid. Hot take, capitalism is better than feudalism. I know, absolutely mind-blowing analysis here. However, the reason that capitalism worked as a follow-up back to feudalism was, quite frankly, because it preserved most of the core features of feudalism whilst giving the serfs a little bit of aspirational material. You ever wonder why a landlord is called, well, a landlord? Well, it's because the concept of private tenancy dates back to the days of feudalism, when the lord of the land would essentially allow a serf to exist and not die on his land in exchange for a majority of the produce and profits they gained whilst there, in much the same way a landlord will allow a tenant to exist and not die on his property in exchange for half their paycheck or even more nowadays. The concept was so seamlessly carried over that the name didn't even change. Likewise, this practice can be very easily compared to modern work practices in the world today, with the serfs or workers being given a choice to either work for a local land baron or die, in much the same way as the modern worker must choose between being in employment or seriously struggle and possibly die. The feudal lords of the 13th century, which is supposedly when Robin Hood existed, were not as analogous to big government types, but more to the corporate and capitalist classes that libertarians pretend not to like whilst worshipping Elon Musk, in my opinion. Likewise, calling the taxation of the Middle Ages at all similar to modern taxation is really quite disingenuous. For a start, the taxes a serf would usually pay were in the form of work, usually for the lord 5 or 6 days a week, with the rest of their time given to being able to take care of their own fields, crops and animals. However, much like the way things are today, the needs of the boss and the employers comes first, so a serf was forced to prioritise the work for the lord before they could do their own work or prioritise their own needs or desires. When the lord's crops needed to be harvested, so did the serfs, but they couldn't do so until after they'd harvested the lord's. Of course, serfs also had to pay taxes and fees in return for basic services like food and protection from roaming bandits, but again, this did not go to the king or the central government, but to the lords under which they served. Occasionally, in times of great need, the king would impose higher taxes on the lords and barons, which was then passed down to the peasants, but in general, these taxes were fairly reasonable, at least given the lord's comparative wealth, and were down to the discretion of the tax collectors as to how much was required. Generally, the lord decided how much taxes a serf would pay from how much land the serf had, usually at least 1/3 of their value. They had to pay fees when they got married, had a baby, or there was a war. Money was not very common at the time, so usually they paid by giving food or labour instead of money. In fact, it was more like privatised taxation and indentured servitude than our modern idea of taxation, really. So when it comes to the Sheriff of Nottingham charging ludicrous taxes and causing harm to the peasantry, usually this would refer to the serfs or peasants under his power, and this would, if anything, be more comparable to a corporation, landlord, or local council rather than any kind of big government conspiracy nonsense. This, incidentally, is why when people criticise ANCAPs or libertarians, one of the first points that gets made is that it will simply lead back to feudalism, because a system in which a minority of rich overlords can force the rest of society to work for them in order to pay off, for example, medical debt because they held all the power is, well, essentially what feudalism was. Let's not forget that in order for a free man to become a serf, he usually had to be coerced into it by forces outside of his control or systems of oppression that pushed him to make impossible decisions. Often this was because he owed a large debt with no way of paying it off, forcing him to make an agreement with the lord of the land, trading freedom, labour and much of his life in exchange for the debt being paid off and protection from any further debtors. The lord would usually give him land to work on and he would do work for the lord. All of his children would also then become serfs. You know, like Elon Musk wants to bring about on Mars because he is a Randian nightmare in person form who wants to force people into indentured servitude in order to build his utopian vision on Mars, and they can pay off their debts to him, which definitely won't just end up being Bioshock but in space, I'm sure.
Robin Hood is not a communist symbol, you moron. Robin Hood was stealing from the state. He was stealing from the government that was taxing people. He was stealing from, like, Jeremy Corbyn in this picture. He would be the Sheriff of Nottingham, alright? Like, he taxes people, and Robin Hood comes and steals from him and gives it back to the taxpayer.
Anyone trying to claim Robin Hood as a supporter of any modern ideology is not great at understanding historical context. A figure like Robin Hood is a bit like Jesus, who I might make one of these videos about one day if I decide that I really want a comment section full of angry evangelicals, in that most if not all of the stories we have about them come from a time and a place wholly unrecognisable to anything we would understand today, and ascribing political labels to ancient people is an exercise in futility. Were serfs the proletariat and the gentry the bourgeoisie? Arguably, but feudalism is not the same as capitalism, and trying to apply philosophy based on one to the other is pointless. It's as absurd when we on the left do it as mentioned, when a conservative can claim to be a supporter and believer in Jesus and also capitalism, as if those two things are in any way compatible. However, in my opinion, it would be accurate to say that Robin Hood was anti-authoritarian, both as a character and a symbol, and so potent was he as these things that he was often deliberately gentrified or in some way watered down from the perspective of the ruling class, to the point where Henry VIII felt comfortable enough to dress up as him despite what he represented. He was able to be so far removed from his original context as to be recuperated, just like Che Guevara, Martin Luther King. Arguably this has started to happen with gay pride as well. That which cannot be destroyed by power must be assimilated and recuperated. I mean, his name is now used by an app that helps prop up Wall Street and the stock market, for fuck's sake, but if you look closely enough, his radical origins are still there, hidden beneath all the gentrification. You just have to look. There's a reason we love Thief with a Heart of Gold storylines, and it's because fundamentally we understand the morality tales they represent and the grey areas they exist within. It would be ludicrous to call Robin Hood a socialist, but perhaps even more so to call him a libertarian or ANCAP. Anti-authoritarian at best, and a fascinating insight into politics and philosophy from the time, but we must judge historical characters in their original and intended historical contexts, otherwise we miss important information and perspectives. Radical, however, he certainly was, and his legacy continues to be, centuries later.
Robin Hood, riding through the glen. Robin Hood, with his band of men. Feared by the bad, loved by the good. Robin Hood, Robin Hood, Robin Hood.
Hello everyone, hope you enjoyed this video. I've been working on this one for quite a while whilst I've been putting out other videos, because as you can probably imagine, these long history videos do take a lot of research and time to work on and write, but I enjoyed it a hell of a lot, just as much as I enjoyed the Pirates one, so I think I'm going to make a few more of these. I'm not sure what the next one will be. I did say I might talk about Jesus as a historical figure, but I don't know if I'm ready for that just yet, so we'll see. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, because I really enjoyed making it. And if you do want to support Sheep in the Books, the channel, not like me, well, I guess it's a bit of both. You can donate to me on Patreon if you like. You can become a channel member as well. If you donate $1 or more than $1, I'll put your name or username in the end credits here. If you donate $2 or more, I'll read out your name or username over the credits. And if you donate $5 or more, you actually get behind the scenes little tidbits and updates. So you get the video scripts when I finish them, which depending on how long editing takes can be quite a while before the video is released. You get videos a couple of days early before the rest of them. Usually that works. I didn't on my last video, which was really annoying because Patreon relies on Vimeo and sometimes Vimeo doesn't work, and it can take it took me like 12 hours trying to upload the last one and it just didn't work. So I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to try, I might just do an unlisted version on YouTube or something. Anyway, you'll get videos early. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the video. And today I'd especially like to thank Elise the Mighty She-Beast, Aride, Brydenbeck, Chris Ragnacci, Deckard, Nanzakambe. Next we have Ryan, Brian, it's Brian, Pixels Green, Polite Pigeon, Stacey Solano, Susie M, The Bulk, Tom Newport, Arne Magnus Narang, Orban, and Rioting Pacifist. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and thanks for helping me get to 5,000 subscribers, which is honestly just amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and before I forget, you can follow me on Twitter and you can join my Discord if you like. The links are in the description.